Howdy gamers, and I've been trying to become as irrelevant as possible lately. First I talked about Mole Mini for the Game Boy. Big mistake, makes everyone go crazy, but I just realized that since my time to play Kid Icarus meter is going off, I think I can kill two birds with one stone here. Wait a minute. Here, this isn't my time to play Kid Icarus meter. This is my time to talk about F1 race for the Game Boy meter. You know what? I still think I can make it work.
Kid Icarus, apart from being a series that has a surprising number of characters and items in Smash Bros, is one of the most interesting game series Nintendo has ever made, at least in my opinion. Even disregarding the history of the franchise, the original game on the NES is a weird one. The plot has Angel Land being ruled by Palutena, the goddess of light, and Medusa, the goddess of darkness. Although I might be pretty biased here, Palutena is the cool one and bestows the people on Angel Land with light to make them happy. Meanwhile, Medusa isn't a big fan of humans, which, yeah, I sort of get that, and she turns them into stone. Palutena doesn't like that one though, so she turned Medusa into a monster and banished her into the underworld. However, Medusa didn't like that one, so she teamed up with the other monsters down there, and together, they took over Palutena's palace in the sky. She also stole the 3 sacred treasures in the process, which made Palutena's army powerless, able to be turned to stone. Finally, as one last frick you to Palutena, Medusa sealed her inside the palace in the sky, allowing her to rule over Angel Land and complete her lifelong dream of turning everyone to stone. But before she could be sealed away, Palutena sent down a bow and arrow to Pit, the person in charge of Palutena's bodyguards, who is being held prisoner in the underworld. It's now up to him to get the 3 treasures back, defeat Medusa, and free Palutena from her palace in the sky. Or at least according to the manual, the game just sort of says go Angel Boy go. Anyways, in case you missed the 7 mentions of Medusa I just made, the story was heavily inspired by Greek mythology, and that's all thanks to the guy behind the game, Toru Osawa. He joined Nintendo in 1985, and instead of doing the normal thing like help out with The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, or freaking arm wrestling, Osawa decided he wanted to direct a video game for his first project at the company. He wanted to make it full of what he liked, which is where the Greek myth inspiration comes from, with characters like Icarus, Medusa, and the Sirens. Another form of inspiration though came from Metroid, which was being developed at the time and made him want to develop a similar game of running and shooting. However, he wanted to have more RPG elements as well as the levels to be vertical. The game was actually set to come out in August of 1986 alongside Metroid, however, development hit some troubles. And by hit some troubles, I mean the entire game was being made by one freaking person. By myself, I can make maybe cereal, but that's about it. Whereas Osawa had to write the design document, draw all the sprites, and when he wanted to test the game, he had to bring it to an external company. It was no surprise that the game wasn't going to reach the August deadline, so after Metroid was done, and Yoshio Sakamoto, the director of Metroid, came back from his break and saw the state that the game was in, he realized it probably wasn't going to reach the new December deadline either, at least with Osawa working by himself. Thankfully, he lent not only his own hand, but the staff that worked on Metroid as well. So, with only 5 months to go, and not a lot done, they had to crunch. The working conditions were awful. They were continuously pulling all-nighters, and Osawa couldn't really go home. They were sleeping in the office on literal cardboard boxes spread out on the floor, and being woken up only an hour later by people trickling into work and people waking them up. And despite all that, the deadline kept getting closer and closer, with the game not being completed, culminating in Osawa staying at his desk for 3 days straight, shipping the game at basically the last possible second. It's a shame the game is horrible though. Okay, no, that's not entirely true. I'm being harsh. It definitely has a lot of love and care put into it, from Specknose, who is based off of Hirokazu Tanaka, the Eggplant Wizard partly inspired from the Eggplant Mask and Wrecking Crew, and Komeito, which is fully inspired by the titular Metroid and likely came about after that team came over to help. As far as the gameplay goes, it has the aforementioned running and shooting from Metroid, but in more vertical levels, where most of them have Pit starting at the bottom and making his way up. However, every 4th level in a world takes on a more dungeon approach, where Pit explores a fortress containing one of the 3 treasures and ends in a boss fight against said fortress's gatekeeper. These are huge, unfun mazes with no map whatsoever, and with a lot of the rooms looking similar to one another, they're needlessly confusing. Well, that's not entirely true. There is sort of a map, but in order to use it, you first have to stumble around until you find the check sheet. However, the check sheet is useless on its own, so then you have to find the pencil and flaming torch. Even then, it's not that helpful though, because it won't give you a layout of the fortress itself, it only shows where you are along with the rooms you've been in. The fortresses are definitely the weakest part of the game, and they aren't even the only gameplay change-up. The second world of Kid Icarus, instead of moving upwards, has you playing through 3 side-scrolling levels before the fortress. This is because in the first world you were escaping the underworld, here you're moving across Angel Land, and then the final world brings back the vertical gameplay with the player moving up through Sky World towards the palace in the sky. That sort of begs the question though, what's the final level like? Is it a platforming side-scroller like World 2? A vertical one like most of the game, or since it's the final level, is it a fortress? No to all of those because it randomly becomes a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. Okay, it's not entirely random. Remember how I said Osawa was working on the game for 3 straight days up until the last minute? This is part of what came out of that. It's the only world in the game with just one level, and to make up for how short it is, the level repeats multiple times before you actually fight Medusa. Apparently the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up wasn't due to time constraints though, and was just because Osawa wanted to do something unexpected, at least according to him. Anyways, once you make it through the final level, you beat the game, and similarly to Metroid, you can achieve different endings determined by how you played. However, instead of being based on how quickly you beat the game, they have to do with how many hidden objectives you completed while playing. Each one earns you a point, and the more points you have, the better ending you get. They range from having 999 hearts when you defeat Medusa, to having all 3 enchanted weapons, and each ending gives Pit a different job. With 0 points, Pit ends the game as a farmer, while with the max of 4 points, Pit becomes a full-grown angel. In Japan, there was actually a worse ending than farmer, where Pit got turned into a speck nose, but that was removed from the Western version. Anyways, after that we get a bit of text explaining that Medusa was destroyed and then credits roll. Normally I would move on from the game, but with something like Kid Icarus, it's not really a surprise that there's something wrong with the credits. Notably, the Japanese version literally did not have any at all. Osawa was really disappointed, but I think because of how rushed the game was, there wasn't any time to put in a staff roll. Thankfully, outside of Japan the game did get them, with Osawa receiving credit for the story, characters, and art design, although under different names weirdly enough. Despite the conditions Osawa's first game was made under, he ended up staying at Nintendo, and in fact is still working there today. Not on Kid Icarus though. You might have expected him to work on a sequel or something, but it seems like after the original he was done with the franchise. So you might assume that the series ends there, like most NES games, just a one-off title, no different than Ice Climbers, Duck Hunt, or the mysterious Murasame Castle. But I'm sure you can tell by the way I'm talking, this wasn't what happened. On November 5th, 1991, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters was released for the Game Boy. Not as much is known about the development of this game compared to the original, but I think there's a good reason for that. Obviously, it's impossible to know because no matter how much I've tried, I'm not a 132-year-old Japanese company, but just looking at the little we do know about the game, it feels like it was just made for a quick cash grab. I know, Nintendo releasing something just to make money is a crazy idea, but hear me out on this. The original Kid Icarus, as aforementioned, was sort of a sister game to Metroid on the NES. But it's not just because they were developed alongside each other and with a lot of the same staff. Kid Icarus reused the engine that was made for Metroid. Adding to that, Kid Icarus for the NES sold decently well, making almost $2 million, so I think when Nintendo saw that a Metroid sequel was in development for the Game Boy, they realized a Kid Icarus sequel being developed alongside it, reusing the Metroid 2 engine would be an easy way to make some money. That could explain why Osawa didn't return to the game, and why it's very derivative of the original. I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that Game Boy games are a great colorblind simulator, I'm sure if you put a picture of the NES original and Myths and Monsters side by side, you would not be able to tell the difference. The structure is the exact same. There are 3 worlds and a final level that's a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. The first and third world are vertical platformers where you go from bottom to top, but the second world is a side-scrolling platformer. Then the 4th level of each world has a fortress that's just as bad as it was in the original. As far as changes go, there are hardly any. Some smaller ones include improved controls, enemies can drop heals, and the backgrounds are no longer black, outside of the non-fortress segments, but those are just quality of life improvements. The only big change to the game is that vertical levels now have a bit of a side-scrolling element. In the original game, the vertical levels would only scroll upwards. If you went to the right and there wasn't a wall, you just loop around to the other side. Here though, it does this trippy infinite scroll where instead of looping you around, there's a bit of level before it loops you around, making the levels feel a lot bigger, but it's kinda disorienting. Actually, I guess in addition to those, the story was also sort of changed. It still was Pit collecting the 3 ancient treasures, but instead of stopping Medusa, it's because of a new threat. Palutena has a vision that a demon named Orcos will lead an invasion of demons onto Angel Land, and Pit needs to wield the 3 ancient treasures to stop him. Weirdly enough though, he's not strong enough to do it, meaning that this might be a prequel to the original. Anyways, to get strong enough he needs to climb up the Underworld Tower, go across the Overworld, and finally conquer the Skyworld Tower. After doing that, Orcos appears, who was surprisingly terrifying and once defeated the credits roll. Just kidding, for whatever reason there are no credits outside of the monsters who appear in the game. I guess they're just more important than the programmers. Also, after the credits, despite this being the second game, we get what I think is the first actual reference to the Icarus myth, where we see Pit get too close to the sun, only to have his wings burn off. So, maybe it's not a prequel and I'm just looking too much into things? Although this is the only game where he can actually use his wings without help from something else. You can press A to do a slight flap, which helps you fall slower, so maybe this is a prequel and this is why Pit can't fly? But also official sources have called Myths and Monsters a sequel, so this is definitely me thinking too much about the game that sold worse than Idaho. What's more interesting than my headcanon for a 30-year-old Game Boy game though is the fact that said game initially didn't release in Japan. November 5th, 1991 it came out in North America, in Europe got it May 21st, 1992, but Japan was nowhere to be seen. That especially seems weird, seeing as this game has very little text and was made to generate profit, but I think I have an idea why. Once again, we don't actually know, and this is speculation from the guy who owns 2 copies of Mario Party 8, so please take it with a grain of salt, but I do think it not releasing in Japan just shows that this game wasn't made to be some big sequel to this series. Otherwise it would have been released there, instead just something to make money. Unfortunately, I don't think it did accomplish the only thing it set out to do, as sales numbers aren't known for this title, implying it didn't meet expectations. So, because it didn't make much money, Nintendo didn't bother releasing it in Japan after it failed in both North America and Europe. As a result of this failure, we also didn't see a sequel on the SNES using the Super Metroid engine, or one on the Game Boy Advance using the Fusion engine. That doesn't mean Kid Icarus completely disappeared though, because if there's one thing Nintendo loves more than not giving us entries in an old series, it's reminding us that those old series exist. In 1991, the same release year as the Game Boy title, Pit could be seen in F1 race for the Game Boy. A decade later in 2001, Pit appeared as a trophy in Super Smash Bros. Melee with an absolutely terrifying 3D model version of his NES box art look. In 2004, Kid Icarus finally made it to the Game Boy in Japan, but through the Famicom mini-series of ports, although as a frick you to the West for getting Myths and Monsters, Kid Icarus never appeared in the classic NES series. And finally, later that year in October, Pit appeared in WarioWare Twisted. Sure, it's honestly not a lot, but all of that would change on May 10th, 2006. It was Nintendo's E3 After Hours press conference. The previous year, the Wii had been revealed, so now it was time to show off a whole lot of games for it. One of which was Super Smash Bros. Brawl. They had a reveal trailer that showed off the first look at not only the game itself, but newcomers. First was Meta Knight, to which the audience had literally no reaction to. And then Pit. It's literally like the Melee reveal all over again, where someone got excited for Ice Climbers, except here, it's the whole audience for some reason. He literally hadn't had a game in 25 years. I feel like someone must have been holding them at gunpoint to clap. No matter how much your life is in danger though, you have to admit it's an odd inclusion, but I guess when I say it like that, Pit does make sense for Smash. Sakurai wanted a retro character for Brawl, so He looked at the game with an eggplant wizard and said, why not? Apparently the team had trouble designing him though, which I guess was obvious enough from his melee appearance. They had some sort of look made for him, but Sakurai kept going back and forth between that version and the older illustrated depictions of Pit. In the end though, he decided to design the character as if he had kept receiving games over the years. So with that framework in mind, he created the Pit we now know and reached out to Osawa for approval on it. The same day as the reveal though, an interview was held with Miyamoto and Sakurai where it was asked if there were any franchises they were thinking about reviving on the Wii. You might have expected Miyamoto to then respond with Punch-Out or Donkey Kong Country, but instead he specifically said Kid Icarus now that he's in 3D, and Star Fox because of the Wii pointer controls. Now, neither of those happened, so it's fun to imagine Miyamoto was just lying to mess with people, but 2 years later, an interesting rumor started floating around. It stated that Nintendo was going to be working with Factory 5 for a brand new Kid Icarus game, and then on one of IGN's Nintendo voice chat podcasts, while speculating about what holiday title was going to be announced at E3 later that year, someone said it could be the new Kid Icarus game that they knew was being currently worked on. Now, was that announced at E3 2008? I think you already know that it wasn't, because how could they when they were busy showing off Wii Music, but that doesn't mean Miyamoto and everyone else was lying. As it would turn out, Factory 5 and Nintendo were actually working together on a Kid Icarus title for the Wii. As Miyamoto said in the E3 2006 interview, they were interested in a revival of the series, and in the end they turned to Factor 5 because of their previous partnership during the GameCube era with the Rogue Squadron series. Apparently they were given free reign to do what they wanted, as long as it was built from the ground up as a 3D game for the Wii. But of course, this is a video game revival made in the 2000s when we were getting stuff like Space Invaders Invasion Day, Bionic Commando, and Bomberman Act Zero, meaning it had to be cool. Or at least cool to a middle schooler, which in all fairness is something we all want to be. Instead of having Pit collecting the 3 sacred treasures for a third time, it had Pit much older than he was previously, instead now an adult who had grown up on Earth after being banished from Skyworld for his crimes against the kingdom. On Earth, he protected people, and the events of the game would have him stopping darkness from consuming it. The gameplay supposedly saw a free-flying Pit shooting down enemies similar to the Rogue Squadron games they had previously developed. In the end though, the project fell through after around a year of development. They had shown off a demo to various people at Nintendo, but what they had made was considered too different from what the series was for them to continue. That might seem weird considering Nintendo didn't give them too much direction, but what I left out was that Nintendo literally made a model of Pit in-house for them to use in their demo, which they promptly ignored so they could create their own edgy version of Pit. One might say Factor 5 flew too close to the sun when it came to the title, and as such we never did see a Kid Icarus game for the system. Or at least a new one. When the Wii launched, it did so along with the Virtual Console, where Nintendo would add their older titles to be purchased digitally. In 2007, Kid Icarus for the NES was added, and for whatever reason, Nintendo tweaked the game slightly. Weirdly enough, they changed the password system to remove one that would give Pit extra money and stuff like that. Even weirder though, is that they didn't do it to Metroid, even though Metroid had a code that would mess with the game. Literally, on the 3DS version of Metroid pre-2016, it could brick the system, but yeah, let's get rid of the password that makes the hard game slightly easier. Don't want the kids having too much fun. Although I am getting ahead of myself, because we need to go back to talking about Super Smash Bros. Brawl. It came out and Pit was there. More importantly though, the game was a success. It had sold 1.4 million copies in its first week alone, making it Nintendo of America's fastest selling game, at least at the time. Sakurai did a great job at directing Brawl. The random tripping mechanic truly was a brave yet brilliant addition, and people at Nintendo took notice, specifically the late Satoru Iwata. He was impressed with his work on the game and took Sakurai out for dinner, where he then confessed his love, told him about Nintendo's next system. It was to be their new portable console, and he wanted Sakurai specifically to develop a brand new game for it. Not another Smash Bros though. Iwata thought that it wouldn't make sense because Brawl had just been released. Instead, something a little bit different, and something that wouldn't be made by people at Nintendo. So, that's exactly what he did, eventually deciding on a third-person shooter with air and land battles. He didn't know what franchise or storyline it would follow though, but in the back of his head, he had the idea of reviving an older Nintendo franchise to do it. Anyways, after 3 months in October 2008, he had the gameplay approved by Nintendo. That meant he was going to be going through with it, but he still didn't have an idea for the franchise or general story. But of course, when you are making a third-person shooter Nintendo game, there's a series that's naturally gonna come to mind. Geist. Truly a Nintendo classic loved by all. What comes to mind second though is probably Star Fox. He did actually consider using the series, but he didn't think it fit with what he wanted in mind for gameplay. That's when he realized Kid Icarus did sort of fit the idea of a game with air and land battles. In both of his titles, Pit isn't able to fly on his own, so it would give a good reason to switch between the two modes of play. All that was left by this point was a team to help him make the game. He had previously left HAL Laboratories back in 2003, so he was part of an individual studio called Sora Ltd that had only him and his wife, but this was going to be a game he developed without any outside help like with Brawl. As such, to make development of the game possible, he established a new subsidiary of Sora Ltd known as Project Sora, with their only focus being this new Kid Icarus title. He even rented out an office space for them to work in, although he has said that the place wasn't the best, with stuff like air drafts coming through the windows. Then, the first thing he did now that he had ideas for the gameplay in his company was work on the story. He wrote the entire script for the game by himself before most of the game had even been put together, just so that way the game could take advantage of the story and they would mesh well together. After that was all said and done, the gameplay was worked on, although because the 3DS was so early in development, they had to make the game using the Wii and PC. They still knew the general layout of the system though, and one of the problems they came about was how they would have the character move and aim at the same time. Sakurai initially thought about having the character move using the touchscreen, but he remembered some DS games that were controlled that way not being the best, so he decided on using the circle pad to move and the touchscreen to aim. Anyways, around this time, the public really didn't know what Sakurai was working on. February 18th, 2009, he did come forward to announce Project Sora, saying that not only were they hiring, but also developing a game that wasn't Smash Bros, but other than the vague statement of it being an experience different from anything people have played before, no one knew much. That is to say, until Nintendo's E3 2010 press conference. In March of that year, the system was announced, but our first look at it was here, alongside some games, one of which being Nintendogs plus Cats. But more importantly, Kid Icarus Uprising. A release date was announced as coming soon. It was supposed to be one of the launch titles. Unfortunately though, it couldn't make the deadline and launched a year later in Japan on March 22nd, 2012. The game received a lot of praise at launch, with some mixed reception in regards to the controls. One of the things that was seemingly universally praised though was the soundtrack. Sakurai understood that he could probably get away with just having some up-tempo music playing in the background while everything was going on, but he had other plans. Back during the beginning of development, Sakurai laid out what he wanted for the game, one part being music that perfectly matches everything taking place in the changing events throughout levels. As a result, the game ended up having over 3 different composers along with a music director and orchestrator. They all worked together to make sure the music matched the gameplay and didn't interfere with the dialogue. Speaking of the dialogue, that's another thing this game was heavily praised for at launch. Sakurai was always annoyed when stories in video games would interfere with the gameplay, whether it was games taking forever to get started because of story bits or it putting the player in annoying predicaments. To remedy this, the story is actually happening constantly during the levels themselves. This is through voice-acted dialogue between Pit, Palutena, and occasionally other characters. The voice acting is genuinely really good and not only makes the levels more entertaining, but allows the story to never get in the way through the form of a 10-minute dialogue dump. As for the story itself though, I guess it's better than the previous games, but that's like comparing the story of the first Mario game to Mario Odyssey. Okay, bad comparison, but you get what I mean. I won't go into spoilers, but Kid Icarus Uprising has Medusa back again and Pit facing off against her. I know I just described the plot of the first game again, but I promise there's more to it. I just can't go further than that for spoiler reasons. The story actually goes all over the place, which is sort of why I dislike it. Multiple times from one level to the next, the entire focus just changes, leaving everything feeling disconnected in a way. You'll go from one plot line to another, never resolving what came previously, And while everything does get wrapped up in the end, it just doesn't feel very cohesive while playing through it. I've heard some people like that about the game though, saying that it means the game never focuses on one thing too long, and while I get that, I would have preferred if the game at least wrapped up the previous plotline or gave some sort of closure before moving on to something else. I still liked it overall though, and it was definitely helped by Sakurai's sense of humor. As you might have guessed, back when Kid Icarus for the NES originally came out, Sakurai played it, and one of his favorite things about it was how the game didn't take itself too seriously. Other games at the time had you fighting evil in a dead serious manner, but Kid Icarus was always sillier. It was a game about Greek mythology where you could have a credit card, so when making Uprising, Sakurai wanted to continue the lightheartedness. Because of that, the game is funny, although I think some people overreact to the humor here. Parts of it can feel straight out of a Marvel movie, and not in a good way, but there are jokes that do land. Also, obviously I didn't play the Japanese translation, so the localization team did have a part in the humor of the game. Actually, Sakurai has even said he gave Nintendo of America a lot of leeway so that the game would still be funny. According to an IGN interview with him, he said Kid Icarus Uprising takes advantage of the nuances of Japanese conversations. So, he gave Nintendo of America the go-ahead to change that as much as they wanted, so everything would sound natural and enjoyable. Despite that though, parts do still feel like Sakurai's humor. Honestly, a lot of what's in Kid Icarus feels like Sakurai. There's trophies, challenges, difficulty sliders, and a lot of customization with how you want to play. The game is just filled with so much content and love. There's even stuff that only fans of the series would get, which I appreciate. Stuff like returning bosses and other references to the first game were really appreciated. Weirdly enough though, there aren't any references to the second game at all outside of Pit's design. He has the golden leaves in his hair, the blue eyes, and the arrow, all of which were established in the second game. Although, to be fair, the design in Kid Icarus Uprising is basically the same one he had in Brawl, so it's more accurate to say that that design referenced the second game. That doesn't mean the game isn't faithful to the first game though. It honestly feels like a love letter to it, as if Sakurai knew there wouldn't be another game in the franchise. Don't get me wrong, we've still seen love for the series since. Pit appeared in Super Smash Bros. 4 and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, with those games even adding some new characters from the series. 4 saw the addition of Palutena, and then Ultimate gave us Dark Pit. Not to mention, 2 months before Kid Icarus Uprising came out, on January 18th, 2012, a remake of the first Kid Icarus came out. It's nothing crazy, but Nintendo had a series going around the launch of the 3DS called 3D Classics, where they would remake past NES games, mostly keeping the original art style, but adding a 3D effect to them. Some games were more lucky than others though, like Kid Icarus, which received backgrounds for the vertical scrolling levels to better represent what's happening in the game's story. It was even included as a pre-order bonus for Kid Icarus Uprising in some regions, which was pretty cool. Then, a month later on February 8th, 2012, Japan finally got Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters through the 3DS Virtual Console. Other regions got it as well in the 3DS, meanwhile the Wii U received a port of the NES game. It seems like this is one of the series that Nintendo loves to port, because when the NES Classic came around in 2016, Kid Icarus was featured. Although, not in the Japan version weirdly enough, especially since it was part of the Famicom mini-series of GBA ports. Finally though, we would get one last port of the game through Nintendo Switch Online in 2019, coming to all regions. As far as the sequel to Uprising, or really any continuation in general goes, things don't really look the best. After the development of Kid Icarus Uprising, the team behind it, Project Sora, closed, and every time it's been brought up, Sakurai has been against a sequel. Even when the game came out in 2012, he said that he made Kid Icarus Uprising so people could have a short but deep experience, and because of that a second game would get old. As recently as the game's 10th anniversary in 2022, he was still against this idea. As far as a port or remake of the game goes, he's even shot that idea down, saying he doesn't think it's possible. That does seem a bit weird, since the game would honestly benefit from having two sticks, because there are some people put off by the controls, and it's near impossible for left-handed people to play, which personally I think is a good design choice. A remake on Switch could fix the issues people had with the controls, while preferably still keeping it inaccessible to left-handed people, but in the same 2022 tweet where he said no to a Kid Icarus Uprising sequel, the same thing was said about a remake. So, I'd say it's a pretty forgotten franchise.
And on the official Eric Derek Will This Franchise Come Back scale, I give it a probably not. I'm not gonna outright say no, because I feel like if Nintendo really wants to make a remaster of Kid Icarus Uprising, they will, but I feel like they would have done it by now if they're planning to, and Sakurai's statement on it sort of proves that there's not one in development at the moment, otherwise he would have just stayed silent on it. As for a sequel, I know Sakurai said he could see someone making one in another 25 years, but I think that was more of a joke than an actual prediction. Anyways, if Nintendo's not going to make a Kid Icarus Uprising sequel, I can just do it myself. Or I could talk about Mole Mania again. You see, there's this guy named Jinbe, and he